Hello again and welcome back to my channel and welcome to part 2 of the insane case of Pándy András, who was a serial killer, rapist, incestuous, fake pastor. He was a lot of things and we have a lot to cover in today's video as well. We are only halfway through the story and I feel like the end of this is a million years away. The usual content warning is the same as in the last video. We are going to be mentioning rape, grooming, graphic descriptions of murder, a possible sex trafficking ring, and a lot of other things. So if this is not your cup of tea, then don't watch this video, and I totally understand that. Maybe you want to watch something else on my channel, maybe not, all of them are like this. But now let's get started with part 2. First of all, let's start out with a little reminder of what we have learned last week. Pándy András was a Hungarian man who moved to Belgium, where he worked as a fake pastor without any credentials. He had 3 kids from his first marriage, and he was also sexually molesting his children and had an incestuous romantic relationship with his own daughter ever since she was only 9 years old. He also had a fraudulent religious foundation that he kept all the money to himself, of course. And after he divorced his first wife, multiple women from Hungary came to visit him in Belgium, but they all mysteriously disappeared. He remarried with another Hungarian woman who moved to Belgium for him and also brought her 3 own daughters from her previous marriage. But then she also gave birth to 2 of András's biological children. While he had this incestuous love affair with his own daughter Ágnes, he also started molesting his teenage stepdaughter Tímea, who eventually gave birth to his son too. And when Ágnes attempted to kill Tímea out of jealousy, Tímea was able to escape and move to Canada with her baby son. And Edith, Tímea's mom, his new wife, when she found out about the incest and what was going on in this crazy household, he confronted András about it, who then decided to do something very, very bad to her. This is where we are going to pick up the story. When András and Ágnes come to the decision to kill Edith, to silence her, and to get rid of her because now she knew too much. They came up with this malevolent plan. On the 31st of July, 1986, the 2 forced Edith to write a handwritten letter stating that she was leaving András and she was going to move to Germany with her youngest daughter. But of course, that was not what's going to happen to them. Edith and her daughter Andrea weren't going to move to Germany. Because after the letter was written, András beat Edith to death with a hammer, and after that, Ágnes beat Andrea to death with the same hammer. Edith was only 44 years old, while Andrea was only 15. And the way that they got rid of their bodies is just so disgraceful, so humiliating, so cruel, and unnecessary. They took their bodies to the basement where Ágnes cut up their torsos and took out their internal organs by hand, and András cut the bodies into little pieces. They then submerged these pieces in acid to get rid of the evidence, but the bigger chunks that the acid couldn't disintegrate, they would bring to the local slaughterhouse and throw them in the bin that was for collecting the unusable body parts of the slaughtered animals. I don't know if there's a proper name in English for this bin, but what a humiliating and disgusting way to get rid of a person's dead body. And finally, András traveled all the way from Belgium to Germany to mail this aforementioned handwritten letter that they forced Edith to write. And he mailed it to himself in Belgium to make his story make sense, to make it look like Edith really was in Germany, and that's where the letter was arriving from. Now, let's do a head count again, because so far a lot of things have happened. Now that Tímea and her baby son Mark were off to Canada, and Edith and Andrea have just been murdered, only András and Ágnes, as well as Edith's remaining daughter, Tünde, plus the two children that Edith and András had together, Réka and András Jr., were left. Tünde was now 16 years old, and she was in this belief that her mother and her younger sister left her behind and just went to Germany without her. I am sure that at the very least this was confusing to her or weird as to why her mom and her sister would just up and leave without a word, but I feel like it was probably more devastating to her that she was left with his abusive, terrible, horrible, disgusting stepfather so abruptly like that. I'm sure she must have felt so left out and confused about what happened to them. Well, András planned it out like this for a reason. He knew what he wanted to do with Tünde. You see, up until now, he was only Tünde's stepfather. He didn't have any kind of legal authority over her. So now he wanted to legally adopt her so that he could control and abuse her the same way as he did to his other children. He also began molesting her sexually, and by this point, the abuse in his household was getting unbearable. And this is when András's ex-wife and older son come back in the picture. Do you remember when I told you in the beginning that his ex-wife Ilona and his two sons Daniel and Zoltán moved away and lived in a different house? Also, if you remember, András didn't only begin molesting Ágnes at a young age, but also at least one of his sons, Daniel, but possibly the other son too. If Ilona didn't know about the sexual abuse going on then, well, she surely knew now that the boys were in their 20s. That is because Daniel and Ilona now joined forces to do everything in their power to prevent András from legally adopting poor little Tünde, so that he couldn't subject her to the same kind of sexual abuse and rape as he had done to all of his other children. Now, you can guess what happened next. András now thought that his ex-wife and his son was just a menace in his life that he had to get rid of. So he and Ágnes came up with yet another evil plan to kill them. In the March of 1988, they invited Daniel over for lunch to just talk about this topic, the topic of the possible adoption, and just pour their hearts out and share their thoughts. So when Daniel arrived, he thought that that was what's going to happen. He was going to have a nice lunch and just talk about why he think András shouldn't proceed with the adoption. But of course, that's not what happened. When he arrived, they sat down for the lunch to eat, and suddenly Ágnes just took a gun and shot her own brother in the head from close range. Soon after that, they also coaxed Ilona, the ex-wife, over to the family home with a similar excuse, like for lunch or dinner or something like that. And when she arrived, András shot her in the head the same way. And then 2 weeks after these murders, the last son from his previous marriage, Zoltán, became very worried about the whereabouts of his mom and his brother, and he asked András if he knew about where they were, as he was supposed to be the last person to see them alive. So guess what they had to do? They had to get rid of Zoltán too. They invited him over to their home as well, And when he was completely unsuspecting, they shot him in the head too. They then went ahead and got rid of the bodies the same way, as we already know. Ágnes gutted them out, and András cut the bodies into pieces, submerged the smaller chunks in acid, and took the leftover body parts to the slaughterhouse and put them in the same collector bin. So now, with his ex-wife and his 2 biological sons out of the picture, András was free to molest and rape Tünde as he pleased. However, Tünde was now 16 years old, and just like when Tímea was 16 years old, she also knew that this was abnormal and just brutal and bizarre that this was going on. And she was tired of the abuse. She was tired of being raped on a regular basis. And she started heavily revolting against her stepdad. But András, being a control freak and a complete narcissist, didn't like this. He didn't like the resistance. So he thought that the best and easiest next thing to do is just kill Tünde too. She had to go next, and in 1989, András sent her other children, Réka, András Jr., and probably also Ágnes, away on a weekend getaway. And when they returned home, Tünde was no longer a resident in the house. You don't need to think too hard to guess what might have happened to her. It is unknown how Réka and András Jr. even survived in this house. At this point, they were like about 9 or 10 years old, more or less, and I don't know if they knew about the murders and the rape and the abuse going on in the house. I don't know if they were also the subject to the rape and the abuse, or they were completely oblivious. There is no information about that. But I mean, it would be kind of hard for anyone to ignore mysterious disappearances and such terrible abuse. You know, like it's not something that you can just not notice, especially when it's so blatant. So anyway, let's do a head count again. Who is still left in this house? Besides András and Ágnes, the murderers of course, and Tímea and her son Mark living in Canada, we only have the 2 children that András had with Edith, Réka and András Jr. That means that this father-daughter dream team murder couple has already murdered everybody except for the 2 youngest kids in the family. And András took extra care to make sure that he wasn't going to get caught for all of these crimes, and I mean, it didn't work out in the end, but let's not get too ahead of myself. He wrote letters in the names of his missing family members, and he even hired actors to pose as his family members and write him letters that he got them to send from abroad to make it look like all of these missing family members just were living happily and healthily in some other country. He went as far as to send himself a letter from Brazil to pose as Daniel, one of his sons that he killed. He regularly sent himself letters from Germany to pose as his ex-wife, so he went great lengths to keep up the facade. And the last one of his crimes comes now. Remember when I told you earlier that his fake religious foundation that was shut down back in 1978, and we have no idea about how he made a living after that time, how he had so much money for the next 20 years to be able to afford all of these houses and properties. You won't believe what I'm about to say. He literally imported orphans from Romania, and nobody knows what happened to those orphans when they arrived in Belgium. I mean, my best guess is that he sold them into sex slavery or something of that sort. You know, such underworldly crimes is something that I can imagine him doing. And we are talking about dozens and dozens of orphans who were probably sent to Belgium in the hopes for a better future so that they can escape what Romania was during this time. And what they got instead is just unthinkable. So it is my best guess that he sold these orphans for good money, and that's how he was able to make a living for himself for the next 2 decades. So how was András and Ágnes caught at all? How do we know about all of this? Well, we have to jump around in time a little bit to make it make sense. As we have already talked about it before, Ágnes sometimes suffered from a jealous rage or a fit that she went into every time she had a conflict with her dad or every time she saw him in the presence of another woman, and she just could not control her anger when another woman was around her dad, which is fucking disgusting just for 2 reasons. A, it's her dad. B, András was ugly as fuck and disgusting, so I don't know what made her jealous, honestly. But anyway, perhaps something like that could have happened on that fatal day in 1992. 3 years since the last known murder. After a possible argument with her dad, she came forward to the police and told them that he had been molesting her sexually ever since she was a child, and that their family members were mysteriously going missing, and that she just knew that he had something to do with it. He knew that he had a hand in all of these disappearances. And I mean, she wasn't lying, she technically said the truth. She just forgot to mention that she was an accomplice, and a willing accomplice at that, in all of these crimes. So the police questioned her for about 6 or 7 hours. They listened to every single detail that she had to say, and then they called András in for a questioning too. Of course, they wanted to hear his side of the story. And András only had to say that, sorry, Ágnes is this crazy, mentally unstable woman. Of course she's lying, she's not to be trusted. And that alone was enough for the police. They just did not look into any of the claims that Ágnes said, and this whole case was closed. That's it. Now, I'm not sure if their incestuous relationship continued after this ordeal, but they were not on the police's radar up until 1996. That was during the time when the Belgian police were in very deep into investigation regarding a ginormous sex trafficking ring there. It was huge, it was all over the news, and somehow Pándy András's name just kept coming up during their investigation. So they remembered, interesting, a couple of years back, we actually had a chat with his daughter, Ágnes, and probably we should call her back in for a questioning again. So now in 1996, they called Ágnes in and they had a little chat with her about whether she knew something about this possible sex trafficking. I mean, remember the Romanian orphans? Could be relevant. And in the beginning, she acted kind of weird. She was off. So the police just knew that she was covering something up. And then she said that she was sick and wanted to go for an hour-long walk in the park. This was such a stupid decision from the police. She could have escaped, or she could have fled right then and there. And they just allowed her to walk by herself. But actually she did not escape, so that's good. When she returned to the police station, she sat down and told absolutely everything to the police from the beginning to the end. And the police was like shocked. This is not something that they had expected. So just a couple of months later, which was in the very beginning of 1997, András was taken into custody and he was investigated thoroughly. The police searched all of his houses, all of his properties, and guess what they found in one of them? In one of the houses, they found the skeletal remains of at least 8 women, all aged between 40 and 50. And sadly, these bodies had been there for so long that they could not be identified anymore. But remember back in the 70s when András used to put up ads in the Hungarian newspaper, and at least 8 women responded to that, who were all middle-aged, divorced women, desperate for love or desperate for an escape from Hungary. Could these remains belong to them? I mean, in my opinion, yes, definitely, but they could not be identified for sure. And since the police could not identify the remains anymore, and they could not prove without a doubt that he for sure had a hand in how those remains ended up on his property, they had no evidence against him besides Ágnes's confession. And of course, he denied everything. He said that Ágnes's confession is just a pile of bullshit, that she was lying because she was mentally unstable. And he also had the letters to prove that his missing family members weren't missing at all, that they were living abroad and sending him letters on a regular basis. But then, of course, all of those letters were proven to be faked and that he got them sent to himself from abroad. And the police also could not prove that he really had a part in the sex trafficking. We know that he brought Romanian orphans in the name of his religious foundation, but as I said, nobody knows what happened to them, so it couldn't be proven for sure that they were sold into sex slavery. But I mean, what's your best guess? Sex trafficking allegations, him bringing orphans from another country? You just have to think, honestly. You just have to use your brain to make a connection there. But somehow Ágnes's confession was still enough on court, and András was actually convicted for the murders of all of the family members and for the fraud regarding his fake foundation. He was sentenced to life in prison, but Ágnes also got 21 years in prison for participating in these murders. And interestingly, Ágnes was let out on parole way before the end of her sentence. And guess what she went on to do next? Like, this is the biggest of all the plot twists in this story. The biggest one is this one. You won't believe what Ágnes went on to do after she was let out of prison. I'm gonna give you a guess. You have 3 guesses. She became a nun. She became a nun and lives in a nunnery. An incestuous serial killer who is responsible for murdering half of her own family and possibly had a hand in the sex trafficking of orphaned children is a nun. I don't know what kind of paperwork you have to fill in before you can become a nun. Like, why do we even bother sending people to prison when you can just make them become a nun? I don't understand. Like, they don't have any kind of filtering on who they accept at all? You just make a confession to the priest and that's enough? Like, I don't understand. I'm sorry, I'm just enraged because this is unbelievable. But if she's still alive, which I believe she is 64 years old. András was convicted when he was already 70 years old, so life in prison wasn't going to be too long for him. And he actually died on the 23rd of December 2013 at the age of 86. It enrages me how he only had to serve 16 years in prison for all the crimes that he committed against humanity. This man just served 16 years in prison before he conveniently died. Like, it's crazy how he lived a full life, he had all this money, he had properties, and none of that was ever enough for him, and he always wanted more, and he took what he wanted in the forms of human lives for absolutely nothing. He gained nothing out of this. But there were some rumors that he was raped in prison. And I mean, poor guy. I'm so sorry for him. In the end, we know that Tímea moved back to Hungary from Canada, but we don't know anything about what happened to her there, what kind of a life she had there, and we also have no information about either her son Mark or the other two children, Réka and András Jr. I mean, they were the only surviving people in this unbelievable hellhole. I kind of wonder if these two youngest children, Réka and András Jr., would have also eventually fallen victim to either András or Ágnes, because knowing what they had done before, I don't know if anything would have stopped them from doing something terrible to these young children too. Or were they somehow protected or favored over the others? Was it because of their age? Or was it some other reason that they seemingly did not suffer from any abuse? Or were they actually already abused and we just don't know about it? I don't know. But that is the end of this case. I mean, I know that this was so fucked up on so many levels, and there were just, it was a lot. Okay, let me know what you thought about it down in the comment section, and make sure to subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, because I'm planning on returning and making content a bit more frequently than once a month, but I can't promise anything. So thank you so much for watching. Thank you for taking your time and listening to the stories of the poor victims of this case. And I hope to see you next time. Bye.